One moment, guys. Okay, hello everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. As mentioned, I'm a linguist, an applied linguist, so this talk will be a little different from the previous two presentations. When I first started going to conferences, I remember being advised to start my presentation with a pretentious quote to lend my presentation the air of sophistication. So that's what I've done, and I've started with a quote from Richard Sherevik's Trench. Does anyone know the man? Neither did I until yesterday when I searched this quote. And he had the following to say. He was an archbishop and he was a poet. He said, "Language is the amber in which 1,000 precious and subtle thoughts have been safely embedded and entrenched." I'm going to repeat that again. Language is the amber in which 1,000 precious and subtle thoughts have been safely embedded and entrenched. And this is the overarching idea that runs as a theme through this presentation. So in this presentation, I'm going to provide some examples using data from the British press of how these subtle thoughts can become entrenched in the language we use on a daily basis. So in particular, I'm going to be focusing on UK press journalism around schizophrenia. So how is schizophrenia being represented in the British press, and how are certain outdated assumptions, these subtle thoughts, how are they embedded in the language that journalists use, and how do they reflect maybe an outdated way of thinking? So this is from a larger project which I conducted for my PhD, looking at how schizophrenia is represented in the UK press. I'm going to present two short case studies here as examples of these subtle thoughts being embedded in language. First, that's the overarching project. First, I'm going to look at the phrase "released into" and look at its meaning and its use in UK press journalism. And then I'm going to look at metaphorical uses of schizophrenic, the word schizophrenic, as an adjective. These are examples of these subtle thoughts being embedded in journalistic language. So some of you may be wondering what schizophrenia is. Put your hand up if you know what schizophrenia is. Some of you. But you can be forgiven for not being sure what it is, because there's quite a bit of uncertainty even within the medical profession and some controversy around the diagnosis itself. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just included the diagnostic criteria here, which is listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, specifically the 5th edition. So to be diagnosed as having schizophrenia, you have to exhibit 2 or more of a set of symptoms. And the most commonly referred to in the press are the following. So first, there are delusions, and these refer to fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. So for instance, the delusion that's often referred to in the British press is someone's delusion that they're Jesus Christ, for instance, or that someone else is the devil. That's an example of a delusion that's referred to in the British press around schizophrenia. You're probably more familiar with the concept of hallucinations, and these are referred to in the DSM as being perception-like experiences that occur without an external stimulus. They are vivid and clear with the full force and impact of normal perceptions and not under voluntary control. So the press tend to refer to auditory hallucinations, so hearing voices, but also visual hallucinations as well, so seeing things that aren't there. And these symptoms must persist for at least 6 months for you to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. So that's what schizophrenia is, at least according to the DSM. So now on to what schizophrenia isn't. People with schizophrenia are, of course, very vulnerable members of society, and still there are stereotypes and misconceptions around the disorder which persist even within the medical profession itself. And 2 main ones, which are quite relevant to what I'm going to talk about in a moment, are the following. So first, there's this assumption that people with schizophrenia are particularly violent and dangerous and should be avoided. Actually, only a small number of people with schizophrenia actually commit violent crimes. And once you factor in drug abuse, people with schizophrenia are not statistically more likely to commit violent crimes than members of the general population. They're also 14 times more likely to be the victims of violent crime than they are to be the perpetrators. So this is not an accurate assumption. There's also the misconception, I should have written that on the slide, there's a misconception that schizophrenia is the same as having a split personality disorder. And this is a misconception that I held before I started doing my PhD, in fact. So in Denmark, there was a study that found that 71% of respondents that they interviewed about their knowledge of schizophrenia, 71% of those thought that schizophrenia was having a split personality disorder. And interestingly, more than 29% of those interviewees said they knew someone with schizophrenia. So there were people who knew people with schizophrenia, but still thought it was a split personality disorder, which is worrying. Okay. So as I've mentioned, what I'm presenting today is part of a larger study that I've conducted into representations of schizophrenia and people with schizophrenia in the UK press. And to investigate this, I built a large data set that we call a corpus in corpus linguistics, composed of all news articles published by the UK national press between 2000 and 2015 that mention schizophrenia, either as a main topic of the article or in passing. So that included references to schizophrenia, also the word schizophrenic, also the word schizo. So this included hard news, but it also included entertainment, as we'll see in the examples that follow, references, articles report on sport, for instance. It featured 5 tabloid newspapers listed there, and also 4 broadsheet newspapers listed there. And in total, it was about 15 million words. Or tokens means their words. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of reporting on schizophrenia in the UK press. Okay, so finally on to case study 1, the meaning and use of the phrase released into. This is my first example of subtle thoughts embedded in language. The phrase released into occurs 2,253 times in the data set and refers to the process of people with schizophrenia being discharged from a psychiatric prison or a psychiatric hospital. It's typically used in salient parts of the text, such as the headline and also the lead paragraph in articles as well. So it holds quite a prominent position in many of these news articles in which it occurs. So here's an example of how released into is being used. So this is from The Express, published in December 2000, right at the beginning of the data set that I'm examining. And it reports on the trial of someone called Michael Abram, and this is someone with schizophrenia who attacked George Harrison, the member of the Beatles, in 1999. So it's referring to that trial that's occurring at that time. So after the court case, the Beatle made a passionate plea to be told when his assailant is released into, released into should be highlighted there, not just released, into the community. So this phrase, released into, is being used in the British press to refer to patients being discharged from psychiatric prisons or hospitals, presumably once they've been considered well enough to be integrated back into society. Before I continue with this point, just check time, I first need to introduce the concept of semantic prosody. So this is a concept in corpus linguistics, which refers to when the usage of a word gives an impression of an attitudinal or pragmatic meaning, and this is called a semantic prosody. So in other words, it's where a seemingly neutral word has a positive or negative connotation by virtue of the typical context in which it occurs. That is essentially what semantic prosody is. It's a particular sort of evaluative coloring that a word takes on from the repeated ways in which it is used. And obviously, taking this broad sort of view, looking at 15 million words, we can identify semantic prosodies of words and phrases like released into, which I will in a moment. So to take a classic example, the phrase set in, kind of similar to released into in some ways, tends to be used in relation to negative states of affairs. So you have examples such as sort of depression sets in, or rot setting in, or decay setting in. It's never good things that tend to set in. And that's not immediately obvious by just looking at the phrase set in. Except in perhaps very literary contexts, you don't have good things setting in. So to summarize, semantic prosody is when a word or sequence of words retains the semantic flavor of the typical context in which it occurs in. With that in mind, looking outside of this data set in a general data set of English, what context do you think the phrase released into tends to occur in? I'm fishing for an answer. Yep. Yes, you're very, very right there. And that was the, I thought this was a surprising finding. It's less surprising than I think. Good. Any other suggestions?
I was just thinking of someone being released from jail.
Being released from jail, yes. So it has that sort of criminal, those criminal connotations.
You have read multiple times the phrase released into related to something like, you know, plagues in a psychological or religious kind of thing. Like plagues are released into the world.
So you've spoiled my presentation, everyone. I wanted you to say animals being released from captivity, because that's what I thought. And you're all right, I think, in your own ways. So yes, this won't surprise you then. Clearly it surprised me. So yes, I looked in a general data set of British English usage. So this is UK Weber's corpus, so 2 billion words of web-based British English. What you find is that, so I thought it had connotations of animals being released into the wild, and you do get this. I don't know if there are some examples on that slide. There's reference to the natural habitat there. Anyway, 11% of the instances I looked at of released into in this corpus are animals being released into captivity. 30% of the instances, by far the most frequent pattern, refer to pollutants entering an otherwise healthy environment. And I thought this was surprising. So you have examples here. Mobile phones contain many toxic substances which can be released into the air or our water supply when burned or disposed of in landfills. 2/3 of all cancer-causing chemicals released into the environment every year come from factories in the most deprived communities in England. So this tells us, or provides some evidence, that released into is not a neutral word. I suppose some of us knew that already, and has this this negative semantic prosody in British English as a whole, where it refers to pollutants entering an otherwise healthy environment. It's not a massively frequent pattern, but 30% of those total concordance lines, it's not something to be ignored, I don't think. And some of you assumed that this was the case already, which is actually quite interesting. So is it a coincidence that people with schizophrenia are being portrayed in this way, with the phrase released into? Well, there's an interesting link with the rhetoric in the American eugenics era, referring to people with mental illnesses as pollutants that affect society is not a metaphor that is new, of course. So this is an excerpt from the journal Eugenical News, published in the US in 1925. And here the author is describing a particular eugenics study that's been carried out into the Piney families in New Jersey. The objects of the investigation were first to know the sources of the contamination that's polluting the stream of our social life. Second, to cleanse or cut off the sources of the pollution. Third, to quarantine until cured all who have been affected. So this subtle meaning of released into therefore seems to chime with historical discourses around mental illness. And there's this idea that people with mental illnesses are perhaps being implicitly framed as pollutants that pose a threat to society. And referring to discharged patients as being released into the community, therefore potentially frames these people as being unsafe, despite the fact they are being discharged and therefore perhaps deemed safe. Okay. So quickly onto the second case study, which I think is a little less exciting, but a little bit more convincing, perhaps. As I mentioned earlier, this relates to the word schizophrenic as an adjective. So schizophrenic as a metaphor is actually quite common in journalism. You sometimes see it in academia as well. So here's an example from the corpus. This is an example of a sports article. The England captain's dismissal, caught in two minds over whether to leave the ball, was as schizophrenic as the April weather. Obviously, weather can't literally be diagnosed with schizophrenia. So this is an example of figurative language. In particular, it's an example of a metaphor, this drawing equivalence between schizophrenia and something else. So what I sought to do was to understand this underlying metaphorical mapping. What is schizophrenia being compared to? And to do this, I wanted to identify as many metaphorical uses of schizophrenic as an adjective as possible. And to do this, I examined words which co-occurred unusually frequently with the word schizophrenic, which seemed to be unusual and perhaps pointed to figurative uses of language that were clearly non-literal. Obviously, I clicked on these and actually looked at how they were being used. I didn't just read them off here. Ignore the word collocates. That's the technical term for words that occur unusually frequently together. Some of you may know that. So these are the ones that I identified, that these are the collocates, the unusually frequently co-occurring words, which pointed to these metaphorical mappings. So most of these are adverbs, slightly, almost. You can't be literally slightly schizophrenic. You have a diagnosis or you don't. So these tend to point to these metaphorical mappings. I was going to talk about the distribution, but I think I'm running out of time, so I'll just skip that and get to my final couple of points. So after collecting all these metaphors together, I identified what this metaphorical mapping was. So here's another example. My style is schizophrenic. Some days I wake up and I want to wear over-the-top heels to the supermarket. Then other days I want to be really cozy and comfy and wear something that's easy. The underlying metaphorical mapping to me seems to be that schizophrenia is internal inconsistency. And you can kind of see it in the example here. The narrator is referring to herself as schizophrenic on the basis that she's inconsistent. She wears some shoes one day and other shoes the other day. And it was the same with the April weather example as well. The weather was inconsistent, so it was schizophrenic. And my conclusion is that this seems to subtly imply that schizophrenia is a multiple personality disorder. It's never said explicitly in the press that schizophrenia is split personality disorder, but this metaphor that schizophrenia is internal inconsistency seems to subtly sort of convey that idea that there is a split of two opposites. So I'm running out of time. I'll return to my pretentious quote from the beginning to lend the talk some cohesion, perhaps. So the pretentious quote that language is the amber in which 1,000 precious and subtle thoughts have been safely embedded and entrenched. And the case studies that I've shown so far perhaps lend credibility to Trench's point. It is not the case that all meanings are expressed explicitly. Language is a non-diaphanous medium. And the language that we habitually use can sometimes become entrenched with certain subtle thoughts and ideas that reflect outdated ways of thinking. And these can be particularly harmful to vulnerable members of society, including people with schizophrenia. So I think I'm running out of time. I'll end it there. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer those. Thank you.